Today we're going to talk about models of church planting. Whenever I share about the work that we've done in Africa and the churches that we've planted there, the churches we've helped plant here in the United States, one of the questions I always get is, what model did you use? Beloved, there are many models out there, but that question always makes me feel a little uncomfortable. And the reason is, it's not about the different models. It's about church planters who are deciding on what model they want to use before they ever get to the field, before they ever understand who it is they're trying to reach, and they're trying to choose a model and practice that model and get that firmly rooted in their mind before they ever realize who it is they're trying to reach. It would be like deciding you're going to play golf, and you choose your golf clubs, and you go out and you practice, and you practice, and you practice. You get very comfortable, and then you move to an area where they don't play golf, they play cricket. Well, what are you going to do now? You've been planning to play golf, and they don't play golf. They play a different sport altogether. So that question about what model are you going to use, that makes me a little uncomfortable. Do you need to understand models? Of course you do. But you don't need to choose the model you want until after you're in the place where you're planning on starting the church. So when it comes to models, pray, 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 and ask the Lord to let you know about what model it is that you need to employ or how you need to plant a church. So first of all, let's kind of define what models are. For a church planter, a model is a form or expression of the local church that is culturally defined by both the church planter and the people that he's trying to reach. In light of the context of what a church is, the context of where you are, a church planter has to consider the numerous contemporary and historical models, and it's important that they recognize the strengths and the limitations of each of those in the original context, as well in the context of where they're going to use it. For example, strengths. Under various church models, there are several advantages. First, models provide a historical perspective of how the Spirit has worked in the past to birth churches in different contexts. Well, second, models help us conceptualize church planting theories and enable the creation of strategies for evangelizing and assembling groups of new believers. Third, models, they provide church planters with points of reference from which they can begin their work. Having a good understanding of different models gives teams options for working in the different fields that they're going to. Now, there are also limitations. He tells a story there that shows a group of guys who planted churches, several churches in the Southwest in America, and then they went to Brussels, Belgium, and they were going to do the same thing they did in Brussels, Belgium, as they did in the Southwest United States. And it didn't work. Well, there is no one size fits all. There is no church planting model that works in every culture, everywhere, in every setting. It just doesn't, because it doesn't fit the culture. Which leads me to share with you, there's three basic philosophies, okay, when it comes to um, selecting a model, okay? Three basic ones, okay? And some people prefer to um, use a model that reflects their own gifts and skills and cultural background, and then they try to find a people group that matches that. So basically, you're starting with the church planter and saying, what am I good at? What is my culture? And who am I more apt to reach? And then I'll find a group that's more like me and I'll go reach them. I'll go plant a church in that area. Others prefer, or second philosophy is, um, to use a popular model that's advocated by some church planting specialist somewhere, and they pick a model and they want to go and try and implement that in some group. In other words, they run across a model that they like the way it reads, they like the stories that they've heard about it, so they just choose it and go out there and implement it. The third philosophy, they choose to conduct an environmental scan of a particular people group and then craft a model to fit them. Now, as you can already tell, I fit in that third group. That's my philosophy, and that's what I would recommend to you. Understand different models? Absolutely. Read about all the different models? Absolutely. But you've got to craft that model that best fits the area that you're going to serve. Now, some ideal models. If you look on page 315, you will have a type there we call the traditional model, okay? And you'll see there's 9 steps in it. And basically the 9 steps are: select the church missions committee, select the area for the new church, prepare the sponsoring church, and that's having meetings and talking about what they're going to do and how they're going to support and that kind of thing. Cultivate the mission field, start a home fellowship groups, establish the mission chapel, okay, plan the finances, determine what facilities, and then constitute the church. You've done. You go out there, you know who's supporting you, you know how long they're going to support you, you know how long you have to do it, and you go out there and you start with some house churches, and then you find a place, you look at your finances, you rent a school building, a storefront, an abandoned church, whatever, and then you start having meetings and you constitute, and now you're a new church. So that's known as the traditional model. Another model that's very popular is the cell group. And basically, here's how the cell group works. A cell group consists of several small groups that meet frequently as individual cells. Now, in addition to that, they gather for a corporate celebration with other cells. The pastor is the pastor over all the cells, even though each cell group has its own leader and operates that way. Now, each cell is interdependent with the other cells. The life of the church is in the cells. That's where those needs get met. That's where that fellowship occurs. That's where they become prayer warriors for one another. That's where all the ministry takes place. That's where the evangelism takes place. If a cell group decides that we're not going to go to corporate fellowship, corporate worship this week, the church is still going to survive because it's not based on all the cells getting together. Each cell can make its own choice. Now, here's the problem, okay? Each cell usually has its own pastor who oversees the cell. You see that diagram there on page 316. Now, the problem with that is, in some cultures, it doesn't work. For example, Paul Yonggi Cho in the Iota Full Gospel Church in Seoul, South Korea, has over 600,000 members, and every member is a member of the cell group. They only meet together for corporate worship about once a month or once every 6 weeks. But that little cell meets weekly, and that's where the growth and all that takes place. In America, because we are so individualistic minded, a cell group usually takes on its own personality. And if the church, that corporate fellowship, if that corporate fellowship chooses to do something different than what that cell group wants to do, that cell group will break off and form their own little group. For every time a cell group church has met in America, there are anywhere between 500 and 1,000 failures, because it is not always the best fit here in the United States. House church. Well, house church operates a little bit differently, but here is the house church. The house church model differs from the cell group model primarily in two areas. First of all, pastoral leadership and autonomy. The house church may have as few members as a cell group does, but the house church has its own pastor. It would be fully autonomous, even if it were part of a network of house churches. For example, I pastor a church who gets its name from Leawood. There's a street near here named Leawood. There's another church up the road named Berklair, because there's a road called Berklair. Now, even though we may fellowship together, even though we may work together on certain projects, we are two separate churches. So the house church is different from the cell group because the cell group understands that it is only a part of the whole. The house church is the whole and only works in cooperation in a network. It's a volunteer association. So those are three of the most useful models, but there's another one that came out because of Rick Warren and the Saddleback Community Church, and that's often called the purpose-driven church. Now, for Rick Warren, churches should be focused on or organized around 5 biblical purposes: worship, evangelism, ministry, fellowship, and discipleship. In other words, those 5 things are what constitute a church. So here's the way that model works. After developing a core group to form the church, that core group is a group of people who agree to worship together, evangelize, who do ministry and fellowship and discipleship together. Once that core group gets together, okay, and they plan to have a public worship service, that's described as a launching or going public. After that, those present are assimilated or dispersed, if you will, into small groups. Now, with a purpose-driven paradigm, Church planters develop strategies of moving unbelievers from the community into these small groups who will meet eventually and become leaders in the church. So it is really an adaptation, if you will, of a type of cell group. But it works backwards. The church, the core group, starts first. Then they go out and look for small groups. You can call these Sunday schools, you can call them Bible studies, you can call them small group, you can call it whatever you want to call it. And then they come together for corporate worship. But that core group has started first. They already have the place. They already have a place for corporate worship. And they start there and then fan out. Okay? So those are just 4 of the most common church planting models that we see in and around here. But as I said before, you need to really look at where you're serving at. And he mentions panning for gold here, just like the old 49ers in the 49 gold rush out in California. They would go to a creek and they would dip their pan in and they would swirl water around and let the sediment go off and let the gold pop up. What you got to do as a church planter is you look at your field, you walk among the people, you talk to the people, and you learn their culture. And then you go back and you look at all of these different church planting models, and you find out what aspect of each one of those is good and might work in your area. And that's when you have to make the decision and decide what kind of model you're going to use, or are you going to cherry pick and create a new model, perhaps, of what's going to work in your area. Remember, God has called you to plant a church in a particular location. What worked for somebody else may not work for you. There is no one size fits all. So don't be locked into a particular model. You look at what works best for you. Okay? On page 320 and 21, you will see a framework for critiquing church planting models. And I'm going to let you read that because it may take you more time to understand how to apply that to what you're looking at. But you'll notice the stages of the strategy: pre-entry, pre-evangelism, evangelism, post-evangelism, and phase out. But then you'll go across and you'll see the biblical or theological foundations for that, reproducibility among the people in your context, the level of resources needed, the overall strengths of the model, the overall limitations of the model, and the assumptions behind the model. Now, that's a pretty good framework to be able to evaluate what church model you're going to use. Remember, if you don't have to organize it, then wait till you have to organize it. Evangelism is church growth that results in new churches. And you're really wanting to plant a new church. It is key that the church planter understand the people, the area, and the culture of where he's trying to plant the church, and then choose the model to accomplish that.